Suzy Menkes is the fashion world's most respected, long-standing critic. For more than 25 years, she reported on the global fashion industry for the International Herald Tribune. But during the last Paris Fashion Week in March, Suzy took the fashion world by surprise when it was announced that she was moving to Condé Nast to become the International Vogue editor, a new role where she is to pen a global column and write reviews that will appear on 19 different Vogue websites around the world. In her first major interview since taking on this new role, the business of fashion goes inside the new digital-first world of Suzy Menkes. Thank you, Suzy, for sitting down with me today in your very first week here at Condé Nast as International Vogue editor. How does it feel to be here? Is it very different from being at a newspaper?
I feel fantastic, not just being at Vogue, which is exciting in itself, but it's Vogues. My words go around the world to all these different Vogues. We're talking about online, of course, but we're talking about Brazil, we're talking about Moscow, we're talking about China, we're talking about India. And that idea that you can really reach across the world is very exciting.
Before we get into more detail on your new role, I wanted to go a little bit into the past, not to focus on the past, but I think you've had such an interesting journey that brought you here. And I wondered if you could tell us how you ended up in this industry in the first place as a fashion editor and as a fashion critic. And when did you first realize that this was your calling?
I think I should pass this question over to my mother, because she would show you the little newspaper I made at the age of 5, and what do you know, there is a little picture that could be taken as a fashion picture on the front of it. Right from the start, I was always fascinated by newsprint, and when I went to Cambridge University, the first thing I did, my very first day, was to sign up to work for Varsity, the university newspaper. If anyone was a directed and focused person, it was me.
And what attracted you to kind of writing or journalism in the first place? So, writing for Varsity, the Cambridge newspaper, is, it's worlds apart from, say, becoming a fashion editor. I mean, how did that journey happen between Cambridge and now here at the Vogue offices?
I think that in the 1970s, which is what we're talking about, there wasn't such a division between the idea of being a serious journalist and being a light-hearted journalist, if that's what it is. I suppose you could say that what I looked at was the idea of taking what other people, not myself, consider a light-hearted subject and looking at it seriously. Not solemnly, but seriously looking at the industry, looking at what it takes to make a great designer, and just bringing journalistic skills that would be used in so many other ways to the world of fashion.
So it's not easy to break into this industry. Today, young people around the world, many of whom will be following you on Vogue, they all have access to fashion in a way that wasn't possible in the past. It certainly wasn't possible when I was growing up, and I imagine it was even more difficult when you were first entering the industry. Do you have any stories or experiences that you can tell us about what it was like trying to get into fashion?
I think there were two ways that you got into fashion in that era of the sort of hippie or post-hippie era. And one was obviously on the actual side of creating fashion. It seemed much easier then. The Ozzie Clarks of this world just sat down in the King's Road in some little place and made things and sold them. They never went much further, but they just created, as perhaps the Belgian designers have done more recently. But when it came to journalism, do you know something? I think that there's always a need for somebody who can write well, be efficient, do the stories, go out and get the stories. And I think really the person who put me on the path was Charles Winter, Anna Winter's father. Mm-hmm. He was a really wonderful editor, and when I joined the Evening Standard, I started at the Times as a trainee, then I went to the Evening Standard, and he picked me out, at the age of 24 to be fashion editor of the paper. I think there was quite a lot of comments backstage, as you might say, but he was a very good mentor. He really made me understand that as a fashion editor or in any other role in the paper, you are a conduit to the public. You're supposed to take in this information and then pass it on. Of course, now the people who look at these things probably know more than I do about it. But that idea that as a journalist, you've really got to take things in and then explain them in a way that's comprehensible to other people. That's the job.
And of course, after your time at the Evening Standard and at the Times of London, you took on what would end up being a very important role in your career, but also for all of us in the industry. When I first started working in fashion, which was 7 or 8 years ago, everyone told me you have to read Susie. If you want to get smart on the industry, you have to read Susie. Your time at the Herald Tribune and then at the New York Times, talk to us about how journalism, fashion journalism in particular, evolved over that 20-plus year history.
It's very interesting going back to the early years of the International Herald Tribune it was called then, when it was really a paper a social paper for expats. Although there may be a tiny bit of that lingers, it isn't really like that and hasn't been for many, many years. But I think when I came in, I took over from Hebe Dorsey, who was a legend herself. But she did much more about the social life in Paris. I used to write quite a lot about that. Now everything is so different because it's so global and also it's so manufactured by the big groups setting up their agendas in terms of the events that people go to. But that whole idea of fashion as a business hadn't really come out into newspapers. Well, it had, but it was on the business pages. Right. And I would say that's one of the things that I did, that I actually took an interest in who the CEOs of the companies were, what they had to say, and to try and understand what was the process between me seeing something and saying, darling, you were wonderful, and it actually getting into the stores, now it would be online. I think that is very interesting.
So over the course of that, those more than 2 decades that you spent with the Herald Tribune, you met with countless CEOs and designers all over the world. And I'm sure there were some lessons you learned about what it takes to be truly successful in this industry as a designer, as a brand. In your view, could you share with us your insights about what it takes to build a successful fashion business?
I think there's a kind of magic that has to be involved in building a fashion business. It doesn't just happen, but on the other hand, there has to be some core thing, some core element that gives to the whole thing a real sense of oneness, a sense of something original, a sense of something interesting. You can't just sit down and draw out a plan. So I think that what I actually saw, what I lived through, was when the partner of the creative person, the business person if you like, was usually the bedfellow, or had been in the past. So you've got a situation like Pierre Berger, who actually is an extremely cultivated man who knows all about music and all these other things. But he worked with Yves Saint Laurent, allowing him to become the creative person. This doesn't really happen anymore. Valentino and Giancarlo Giametti is another example of that. This doesn't really happen anymore. The designers really are reliant on somebody who is a business person, has a business mind. But I think that although this works tremendously well when you have a Sidney Toledano at Dior, who is an exceptional person, I think that the pressure put on the designers now is really unbelievable. This idea of more and more collections spewed out, resort and all the other things, it's too much. And I worry about that. And I do think that in the case of the bedfellow, or it can be a husband and wife or just friends, I do think that in that case they will see the fatal signs of a designer getting exhausted or overwhelmed. Of course, there's the other side, which is wonderful when everything is properly organised and well run. But the business of fashion is also about making sure that the place of the designer is a happy one.
You very recently, during Paris Fashion Week, took all of us by surprise. I won't forget the moment that I received the press release from Condé Nast, thinking, wow, that was a real surprise. And I think one of the questions I wanted to ask was, just put us into your head for a moment. I think, you've had this illustrious career, and I say that with the greatest respect because so many people in the industry, we all look up to you. And I wanted to understand, for me, but also for all of us, that look up to you, what was it that motivated you at this point in your career to make such a big change?
You know the word that is absolutely of the moment now in the whole fashion world, which is relevant. You have to be relevant, and you have to be relevant too in the world of what is going on in the media. And I felt frustrated because I felt that I was linked, I felt proud to be linked to a newspaper, both the International Herald Tribune and the New York Times, that is renowned around the world. But at the same time, so much else was going on. Of course, I had stuff put up online, but I never got the sense that was the first approach, that the first thing somebody thought when they saw my copy was, let's get that up. But I want to be part of that. I've never been afraid of technology right from the start. You can find a picture of me if you look on Ab Fab, which I think must have been back in the early 90s or late 80s, and you'll see a picture of me sitting there with a computer on my lap. I've never been put off by that idea, and I want to be part of what's going on now. I, of course, have been on Facebook and have my stuff there, and there is a limited amount of time I think that any journalist should spend in glorifying themselves online. But Instagram is fun. I think it's fun to do it, and I want to share things with people. But most of all, I am so proud at sharing what I write with people. Look, I've been writing for years about designers from, let's say, Tokyo. I was one of the first people to talk about the influx of Japanese designers and what it meant. I've written countless articles. And yet those people in Tokyo, maybe some of them have had it sort of faxed over and had it translated. But this is immediate. This is people who can see me and read me and feel me. And I'm thrilled about that.
So is this a digital-first global Suzy Menkes that's emerged?
I would say this is a digital first, that I really can be read everywhere. But I've always been part of this in my head. And of course, all the time doing conferences, I've done videos, so I haven't ever thought of myself as apart from what was going on in the mainstream. But at the same time, I didn't want to have just a blog and retire effectively, because I don't feel like retiring. I've got lots of energy left.
I want to get into the brain of Suzy Menkes. As you're sitting there, you see hundreds of shows every season. You've seen thousands of shows in your career. Take us through the process for those of us who aren't reviewers. How does it happen? How do you review a collection? What are you looking for?
When I see a collection of a designer whose work I know and maybe have followed for 15 years or so, I'm obviously looking at that moment when they are going through the stream of their own creativity and going on a tributary to that. So they're doing something new, they're inventing something new, but they're not leaving behind them, they're not changing totally the face and the image of what they do. That's the moment you look for, and it's very exciting when it happens.
Can you give us an example of a moment like that?
I suppose everybody who has been a long time in fashion would give you the same example of Yves Saint Laurent. This is way back at the end of the 70s, and you're talking about a designer who had done all these tailored clothes and things inspired by the 1940s, and then suddenly we had this Russian collection with all these incredible colours and textures and fabrics, and you just stood there not being able to believe it. It was really exciting and moving. And of course it was part of his persona, but a part we hadn't seen before. And I would say that duplicates again and again in the careers of people that I've seen. And I would say very recently with Mary Katranzu, when she had been doing things that I'm really an admirer of hers and think what she can create digitally. She's one of the rare people who really knows what she's doing. But having really gone to the farthest reaches of what can be done in putting a plate or a cup on your bosoms, she then sort of calmed that down and did something different that was entirely in the same spirit, but it was different. That's the kind of moments you wait for.
Okay. And how do you know when you've seen something truly extraordinary? So you're reviewing a collection, right? And you've seen all of these shows. I mean, when do you know you're seeing, for example, a brand new talent that instantly you're like, this is someone I want to watch? And when do you know that you're living through a fashion moment?
There's that emotion that rises and you can't fake it. I have a picture that was done, a cartoon of people who cry at fashion shows. Hamish was one of them, I was one of them, I won't go through the list. But those of us, all of us who love fashion, know that moment. And of course, I think that Christopher Kane, when he arrived on the scene, that's an extraordinary moment. You just felt this person had all these ideas. And when he did his brain scan collection, I just sat there and thought, how can one person have so many ideas, put so many out there? Yes, there were many too many. For CEOs, it's terrible when there are so many ideas, but wonderful for us.
So the next part of your process, of course, is you have some kind of emotional reaction, or you have some kind of reaction while you're watching the show. How do you take all of that and encapsulate it into words and provide a balanced review?
First and foremost, I will always stick to the idea, the creed, that you've got to write for people who aren't there. I know that everybody now sees it online. They don't actually see the backs of the clothes, of course. They don't even see them in movement. They don't hear the music. They don't really see the set. So actually, they don't see very much at all. But you've got to try, when you're expressing an emotion, you have to try to explain what it is, what you saw. So I often put things in a setting, so for people who weren't there, they can understand it. I also want to describe the clothes in a small amount, not a laundry list of clothes, because that's boring for people. But it's still important for people to understand why this designer is doing something different, either for herself or himself, or in the wider scheme of fashion things. Then when it comes to writing, I write very, very fast, and I hate it when I'm interrupted. Basically, I screw myself up into the back of a taxi, or in the case of Prada, my Prada nightmare, because when I was working for print, of course, there are very fixed decisions about when you can post your final thing. And ours was, I will never forget it, it's in my brain forever, 25 minutes past 7 o'clock in the evening. After that, it's not going to go in the next day's paper. And when Prada was running late, I was sitting there, my hands were literally shaking, because what I had to do was take the whole show in. And this is Prada, probably the most important show of the week in Milan. Yeah. And then I have to take my phone and I have to do it like that. And you can't do that much in that time. You've got maximum 17 minutes, maximum. And that's to correct the spelling and do everything. And choose the pictures, by the way. And so you really have to focus. So that's kind of 200 words that you've got to get out there in 17 minutes. But that's what makes the blood rush when you're a journalist.
Yeah, getting it quick. I mean, I guess operating in the digital sphere kind of frees you from a couple of these constraints. One, you can post something online anytime you want, and you can post as many photos as you want. And there's also, I guess, a more open conversation happening online. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this move from what people might see as an independent newspaper to a consumer magazine. Because, of course, the conventional wisdom is that many of the magazines in the fashion industry have much tighter relationships with advertisers and therefore aren't necessarily able to say what they might really think. We all come to Suzy Menkes because you always say what you really think, always in a very respectful way, mind you. So I guess in one respect, you're freed of the constraints of print in terms of time and space, but there might be new constraints in your new role.
I do not believe that Vogue is going to rein me in terms of what I do. Jonathan Newhouse said to me right from the get-go that this was not the idea, because obviously, what is the point of hiring Suzy Menkes and getting some dumbed-down version? Right. I also can't change myself. I'm always going to be that hopeless fashion editor who'd rather have a bag big enough to shove my laptop in it and a few other things as well, rather than to be sitting there in the front row with the latest handbag, whether or not it has been bought or given. I do have strong views about not accepting gifts. I mean, I won't say I don't mind a bottle of champagne, and I've received some gorgeous flowers. But I don't think that you can be a serious journalist if you are accepting gifts. It's It is slightly different if you're on a magazine, because then you are the persona of the magazine people really has to be in phase with what is fashionable at the moment. And on the salaries that most people are paid, it would not be possible to buy all these clothes. So I can sort of see that. I think it makes sense as a framework for the people. But, let's face it, even if I put on the best of designer clothes, I don't think I'm going to fool anybody really that I'm a Voguette. So my plan is to be known here at Vogue, as I was at the IHT, for my writing.
Do you think fashion writers like Suzy Menkes, someone who's got great historical context, someone who comes with an informed point of view, someone who has an independent point of view, do you think they're a rare breed in our industry today?
I think in all parts of journalism, there are rare breeds of people who really work and look in depth at things. And I think it's true for film critics, I think it's true for political writers, it's true for everybody, we know that. But it doesn't mean that there is now a generation that is dumbed down and doesn't look at these things. It's absolutely not true. A lot of people are very interested in the history of fashion and very informed, probably better than I am. I don't think we should always think it's not as good as it was in that day. It's that back in the day thing is absolutely not my thing at all.
So you have confidence about the state of fashion journalism and fashion writing today in what you see online?
It's hard to define fashion journalism today because, after all, in the past it was about a limited number of people invited or not invited to fashion shows and a limited number of organisations that published the words. Now we're talking about anybody can become a fashion critic, or they think they can. I think it's difficult for people who are writing from seeing things in the pictures to really get a vision of what the show was like. It is not a good valuation. But still, some people, I've always personally fought my way, and when I wasn't invited, I fought my way into shows. Now it's a little easier and perhaps a bit too easy. But I think that lots of people still are still interested. We mustn't look around and say that nobody online is trying to do anything interesting or has got any depth to what they do. There is an enormous amount of trash out there, but then, there are a lot of trash clothes also.
Well, one of the things you said in your first column for Vogue, which came out this week, was with the headline, quite provocative, "Fighting the Bitch Brigade." You wrote, "If the bitches are winning, the true fashion lovers are losing. Suzy Menkes in Vogue is going to be anti-bitch." First of all, that's not typically the kind of headline that one would see in a newspaper. So it's kind of opened things up. But I wonder, what did you mean by that? And why is that the right approach for you?
I don't think online commentary should be judge and jury and always looking at the nasty side. I understand that people who want to draw attention to themselves have to do that kind of thing. But being bitchy about everything is just depressing. Why can't we celebrate? Okay, maybe a lot of people on the red carpet look a mess, and okay, maybe you want to take them apart or complain that they're too Botoxed. You can do all that. But what about the other side? What about, here is somebody who looks fantastic, what a way she or he puts themselves together. There are all sorts of positive things you can say. And if I wished for anything, it would be that positivization. It's a good word, isn't it? Of what is happening on the internet in general. I don't think you see entirely negative things, but you see an awful lot of them. And it's mostly, what concerns me is it's the comments of ordinary people. It's the TMZ people asked what they think, and a lot of what they say is so cruel. And why do you have to pick people apart? We're not all so wonderful, are we?
No. And it's nice that, I was looking at some of the comments that had popped up on your Facebook page when you posted the article, and I think positivity breeds positivity. Someone wrote in a response to what you said that social media has given the mean girls of this world too much power to criticize others without repercussions, and this particular commenter congratulated you on your positive stance. So I think that's a really meaningful and beneficial approach for us as we think about you.
But the second column was very different from the first because it was about students and where things stand today. And that's really a very serious column. I mean, it deserved much more space and much more research. I think the two things that I brought out that really haven't been discussed before are the terrible problems in England, not the death of Louise Wilson, although that's so very sad, but talking about the fact that now students have to have such enormous loans. You know, this is the first generation of students that I've been looking at this summer in England who is leaving the colleges with these extraordinary heavy loans. Of course, this is familiar in America, but not familiar at all to the British. And, you know, looking back, how would Lee McQueen ever have got where he was if he had had to pay out these enormous sums? He'd never have got himself together. We know that. Nor John Galliano. This is 30 years since John Galliano graduated. And, you know, people ask why they don't see any more of these people. Well, this is one of the reasons. The other thing I've picked up in this piece, which I think is very interesting, is going to San Francisco to the Academy of Arts University and seeing there that they're doing this huge online project. You know, they have the possibility, or so they say, of going from 18,000 students, that's for all the arts, to 100,000 by means of the internet. They have created a program, it's already in action, when people from across the world, or people in America who can't afford the tuition as it is and the living and all that, or they want to spread it out, can do this online. Is this viable? I'm not sure. I feel you've got to be there, you've got to be in a college. But this is a subject which is an important one, I think, for people to look at.
One other thing I wanted to touch upon was imagery and how, you know, you wrote something on your Facebook page recently, said the digital camera rocking fashion across the world in nanoseconds changed everything. I mean, you've been around to watch this change in imagery and fashion, right? And I think, you know, I can't even imagine what it was like back in the early day, but maybe you can tell us how the image of fashion has changed, because, you know, we live in a world of instant imagery now. I mean, you know, you're using Instagram too, but what was it like before?
I want to give you a vision of Suzy Menkes, 1988, just starting at the International Herald Tribune. So this is what you had to do. I had my wonderful, faithful photographer, Christopher Moore, who is a genius at doing show pictures, at my side. And when the show finished, we ran, no looking in the camera to see what's going to be, we ran together to the place where this guy, who was only actually good in the morning because he was dead drunk in the afternoon, would develop the pictures and print them out. When we had the prints, somebody got on a bicycle or somebody got on in a taxi and took it to the office, which was in Neuilly, outside the centre of Paris. That is how we got pictures into the paper. And you know, it wasn't much slower than what we're doing now. Of course, it wasn't instant, but that's what you had to go through. And the whole thing of contact sheets, you know, I mean, contact sheets now have this rather beautiful historic beauty. But contact sheets were the sort of bane of one's life because you went through it and the photographers naturally always saw differently from yourself. And these things, it's amazing how it changed. You know, 1985 changed everything. That was the invention of the digital camera for everybody to use. And, you know, like everything else, like Google's new car that will drive without you, you don't believe it's happening until it happens. You think it'll never catch on. You know, these photographers, they're trained to take their cameras and do these pictures so beautifully. And 5 minutes later, they were all on the digital, and that's the way it was. What I think's changed with the instant images is the idea, which is good for journalists, that you can actually pick out the picture that you think is the one that really pulls the story of the show. Especially somebody like Prada, it's true, also Dior, all the major designers, you can catch that one thing. And what is so interesting to me is that all those years I always noticed when we were limited, you see, not online, lots of pictures, but when we were limited to a few, all, I would say, good fashion editors always chose the same picture. You've got a show of 57 outfits. Why do they all choose the same one? Because that's the relevant one.
It's interesting that you talk about digital cameras. One question that might be slightly off topic, but I've always wanted to ask you is, you always have those disposable cameras with you and you're snapping photos, and you wouldn't believe how many fashion people wonder what Susie's going to do with those. What, you know, are you going to turn, some people say, oh, they're just fake cameras because, you know, Susie's just trying to like get you in a random moment, and other people say, oh, she's built up this massive archive and there's going to be a book. Can you kind of set the record straight? Do you have any plans for those photos?
You know what I think is the sweetest word in the English language now? Private. Right. I think the idea of privacy, which is gone, it's completely gone now. But it was something rather special. And I feel that my photos are private. This is not to say that one day they're not going to come out. I also have kept diaries for 25 years. They're private too. And of course, one day I hope that some of them will be published. But I'm not in a rush. In a way, I think photographs become more precious with the passing of time. Of course, nobody who's putting something up on Instagram at this moment is ever going to believe me. But I think that. I think that, you know, a photograph can mature. It can become more painful to look at when you know that this person is no longer with us. It can be more exciting and amazing when you realise you caught a couple right at the beginning of a relationship. There's all sorts of things about looking back on photographs which I'm quite happy to keep for a little while.
Have you developed those photos at all, or are they sitting there to be ready to be developed one day?
Yes, of course I had them all developed. That was the fun of it, going to the camera shop and having them done and looking at them. I still can think of getting the thrill of that. A lot of them have been digitalised and they're all ready to go.
And one day you may share some of them with the rest of the world. I mean, I've learned so much in this conversation. We have the digital first Suzy Menkes using Instagram and embracing digital, but also the Suzy Menkes who's maintaining her private stash of thoughts and comments and imagery. And one day, I think the world would love to see them. I think it's a really super exciting moment for you, Suzy, and I really want to wish you the best of luck in this new phase. We're all very eager to see how you transition your approach to digital. As you say, you've always been someone who moves fast, and now I think the digital world will have trouble keeping up with you. So best of luck to you.
Thank you. It's been fun to talk to you.
You too.